Good morning, everyone. Let me echo Professor Bogue's welcome to Brown University and to one of the first events in the new Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. And I believe this is a tremendously auspicious beginning for what is going to become and what rightfully is a central part of Brown University's mission intellectually and politically. My name is Seth Rockman. I'm a professor in the Department of History here. Most of my scholarly time at Brown University has coincided with these questions on campus. When I arrived here as an assistant professor, it was just when President Simmons convened the committee to study slavery and justice on campus. I had the pleasure of working with Professor Jim Campbell and a number of our undergraduates to do some of the important historical work on the 18th century to discover the kind of things that the Brown brothers were engaged in and to try to put that together into a compelling narrative that would help us better understanding this institution's history. I've waited a long time since then to see this institution, or this institute, develop, and it really is such a pleasure to see the amazing amount of work that Professor Bogues and Shana Weinberg have done this year to get this organized so quickly, so effectively, and I think yesterday's exhibition, which I saw many of you at, Ships of Bondage and the Fight for Freedom, was an amazing testament to their dedication. It's such an impressive exhibition, and I hope you'll join me in thanking them for their excellent work. So our first session today is entitled Freedom on My Mind, and it will feature 3 speakers. Each of them will talk for about 20 or so minutes, and then we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes to ask questions and discuss that particular presentation. Then at the end, we can try to put all of the talks together into a more sort of coherent whole, and so we'll leave time for that at the end of our session. We'll come to a conclusion at 11:45. I will introduce each of the speakers in turn, so I'm not going to bombard you with a series of introductions now. I'll simply introduce our first speaker. He will talk, we'll ask questions, and then I'll do that sequentially as we move ahead. But our first presenter is Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, whose talk is entitled, These Old Wounds Just Won't Heal, Dissing the Diaspora at the UN Race Conference at Durban, South Africa, 2001. Now, there are some figures in a field, in a profession, who need no introduction. And Professor Sir Hilary is one of those people. But needing no introduction does not mean you shouldn't get one and that you don't deserve one. And so I will do my best, however modest this attempt may be, to speak about a scholar who is so important in this field. He is the Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of West Indies Cave Hill campus. And in 2007, Sir Hilary was made Knight of St. Andrews, the highest national honor in Barbados, and an award that could have recognized so many different facets of his scholarly career. The author of numerous academic books on Caribbean slavery, the founder of the CLR James Center for Cricket Research, and the author of the definitive 2-volume history of cricket in the West Indies, a playwright of remarkable productivity over the last decade, and a leading participant in the UNESCO Slave Route Project. Such accomplishments have also earned Sir Hilary several honorary degrees, most recently from the University of Glasgow, from the Kwame Nkrumah University for Science and Technology in Ghana, and earlier from the University of Hull, from whence he'd earned his first doctoral degree in 1980. I first encountered Sir Hilary's work in the midst of my doctoral research on enslaved women in underground economies in 19th century Maryland. It was a short essay in an edited volume called More Than Chattel. But there was enough in those few pages to give me a great deal to think with and to think through, and it just brings me tremendous pleasure to meet you today for the first time. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sir Hilary Beckles.
Thank you so much, Professor Rockwell. Good morning, everyone. Tony, thanks for making this possible. Much appreciated. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
No.
Okay. This paper, this presentation, These Old Wounds Will Not Heal, is a result of a conversation at the UN Conference on Race Intolerance and Xenophobia in 2001. It's a presentation that ought to warn you of the kinds of things that could happen to you if you immerse yourself in politics. I was sitting in my office preparing to present to my students, and a phone call came in from the Minister of Culture who said, the UN is holding this conference in Durban on race and xenophobia, intolerance. It's an intergovernmental conference which suggests that only government delegations will be there. We're calling upon you to lead this delegation to Durban on behalf of Barbados and to put your historical knowledge to work. Of course, one is always suspicious of that kind of invitation, but when you're called by your government to represent it in the UN, it's very difficult to say no. But I made some inquiries. I asked, well, why me? And I was told, well, listen, you're going to be engaged in a conversation primarily with the British government, and the British minister who will be representing the British state has surrounded herself with a battery of scholars. And she is going to be defending the concept that slavery was not a crime against humanity. She will be defending the concept that slavery was all very legal. And she's bringing with her to South Africa historians, philosophers, and lawyers to make the British position. And we need to have our own intellectual firepower. And that was really the context in which the invitation was made. And so we went off to this UN conference, and the politics of freedom and the politics of slavery really kicked in, and it is quite an instructive experience to see the politics of slavery at the level of state power in operation. It really is something far removed from what we do normally in the classroom, even in our writings and in our instruction to graduate students. The first encounter was that, I'm not sure if you know how these UN systems work. The world is divided into categories. For the sake of this conference, there was the European Union, which was one discursive group. Then there was another group called the West. The West was what was left over from the European Union. The West included Japan, Australia, Canada, and so on. These were the developed nations outside of the European Union. Then you had Africa, you had Asia, and then we have finally Latin America and the Caribbean in brackets. So these were the groups that would debate the politics of slavery and the ideology of freedom, and pass resolutions through the UN system that will shape international policy. The first position we know is that the US government has said that they were not going to participate in this conference because the concept of reparations was on the agenda. And both Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice made their statements, and the US government pulled out of this conference. The conference went ahead nonetheless, and in the morning of the opening session, the European Union and the West resolved that if reparations remained on the agenda, that they too would pull out of the conference, which meant that the conference was on the verge of collapse. We spent 4 hours the first morning trying to rescue this conference while retaining a dialogue on reparations. The conference in South Africa, under the lead of President Mbeki, and very much against the background of Nelson Mandela's clear oversight of the conference, who wanted to ensure that historical issues, crimes against humanity committed in the colonial period ought to be discussed And this was Mandela's own position, but this placed his government in some difficulty. No one wanted to see the conference collapse in post-apartheid South Africa. So you can very well imagine the wider implications if such a conference organized by the UN was to collapse in South Africa. And after 4 hours, the West and the European Union and Asia agreed that we should proceed, but the concept of reparation ought to be placed in brackets with an asterisk on the agenda. In the UN system, if a concept is bracketed, what that means is that the dialogue is entirely informal. It has no formal significance. Whatever conclusions are drawn are not binding on any participant in that conference. And so historical crimes against humanity within the context of the slave systems were bracketed with an asterisk indicated informal, non-binding. And that is how we proceeded. Now, the Caribbean obviously had a very strong view on this because the Caribbean felt that this is really where the systems of slavery as we know them, chattel slavery, took the greatest form. Most of my early work on Barbados suggested that Barbados was the first slave society in the Atlantic modernity, not the first society with enslaved peoples, but the first society built entirely on the basis of a slave economy. With no frontier, no alternate forms of living and of production and organization. And while it had emerged out of Brazil in terms of the trajectory of slave systems in the Atlantic, at least Brazil had a frontier, and there were other forms of economic life, other forms of social organization. At Barbados, the English arrived and found an empty island. And if you arrive and find an empty island, and the historical record suggests it was the only empty island in the Caribbean, and it's fascinating because they arrived and found an empty island, but also noted that the houses and the villages were everywhere because the native population had either vanished into the neighboring islands where they could defend themselves, or there were the results of kidnapping and slave raised by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and therefore the island was empty, and they built from scratch a slave economy. So the politics of this circumstance came to the fore. In the afternoon, we addressed the issue of slavery as a crime against humanity. The European Union delegates, led by the British, argued that it could not have been because it was legal, that slavery was legalized throughout the British colonial system, and as such, the British were operating within the context of a jurisprudence that had been legitimized and approved and consolidated through a series of parliamentary approvals by the British state. And as slavery therefore was legal, therefore what happened to the enslaved population was also legal and therefore not subject to that kind of analysis. The resolution which went before the General Assembly, therefore, was that if slavery were to occur today, it would be a crime against humanity, but in the colonial context it was not, though it should have been. And therefore, we spent 2 days debating the politics of should have been. Of course, the Caribbean delegates all voted against this resolution. We were the only part of the world at the UN that voted against this resolution. I was asked to coordinate Caribbean intergovernmental positions and spoke on this subject. And And I wish you to understand the enormous political pressure, because the UN enjoys having its resolutions passed unanimously. And here were a small group of islands preventing the world from achieving a consensus. Here was a small group of islands in the Caribbean preventing the world from forming a consensus on an important matter, that slavery should have been a crime, but it was not. Now, we had expected that the African nations would have stood with the Caribbean on this matter. And to stand with the Caribbean in argument that not only was slavery a crime against humanity, and the British government might have legalized it, does that make it legal? And one of the fundamental principles of international law is that when you commit crimes against humanity, your own domestic law is no refuge. And that is a beautiful principle of international law, because at Nuremberg, it was shown, the German state argued that their Holocaust was legal because the German state had made it legal. And the Third Reich had passed these provisions through the various legal councils, and it was all legal. International law says you do not hide behind national law when you commit these crimes. And so all of these points were ventilated. Now, Nigeria and Ghana and Senegal did not stand with the Caribbean. Now, this was, for the Caribbean, a very disturbing development, and I'm merely reporting, there was a newspaper article written by a young South African under the title, "These Old Wounds Just Will Not Heal," because that young journalist saw there at Durban that West Africa had betrayed the Caribbean. And that was the language that was used, and the language of betrayal. I'm not using a language, I'm using the word dis. Betrayal, I think, is too strong a word in this context, and here's why. The president of Nigeria, General Obasanjo, stated to us that, well, Nigeria, Senegal, and Ghana were in the process of working through an economic development strategy called the New African Initiative. And the New African Initiative was really, in fact, a World Bank development program for West Africa, and to some extent, Southern Africa. And the World Bank had made it very clear that standing in support of issues such as reparations, crimes against humanity, and confronting the West would sabotage the voting approval of this financial package to West Africa. And so West African heads of governments felt that they were caught, in a sense, between a rock and a hard place, of whether to support a diasporic political narrative or to support an economic development package for their economies. And they chose to support the World Bank's position, to secure the funding, while throwing the Caribbean under the bus, so to speak. Now, that is interesting because the East Africans, and East Africa did not play a significant part in the slave trade to the Caribbean world. Of course, they had penetrated into East Africa, but there isn't a strong sense of East Africa as a market for the shipping of African peoples to the New World. East Africa stood by the Caribbean. North Africa stood by the Caribbean. And the language used in the UN forum was fascinating. Algeria, for example, spoke of the role of France Fanon in the liberation of the country from French colonization, and the minister made it very clear that Algeria could not possibly betray the Caribbean on this because the Caribbean had played a very important part in their national liberation. Zimbabwe took the same position. The Zimbabwe minister made a very emotional speech, that when they were in the bush fighting against the Smith regime, that the soldiers were motivated and encouraged by Bob Marley's music, and that Bob Marley's music became the rallying call of the Zimbabwe Liberation Army, and therefore they could not stand against the Caribbean. So East Africa, North Africa stood with the Caribbean, West Africa did not, and thus creating within the Pan-African discourse a significant wound. And this wound remains open. This rift that has now taken place between West Africa and the Caribbean on the issue of freedom, slavery, reparations is now open. I had the pleasure to make a presentation on this subject in Calabar, Nigeria last year, in the presence of the Nigerian Minister of Culture. And I called for Nigeria to change its position and to, in a sense, re-establish an intimacy in the Pan-African discourse. The minister made a statement that that government is no longer in office. There is a new dispensation in Nigeria. Nigeria is going to roll out a new diasporic language, and it's going to reaffirm its commitment to these kinds of conversations. We have to wait. We have to wait and see. And so, finally then, one moment you might very well be an academic in the classroom, guiding your students and supervising your graduate students and writing your text the best you can. At the next moment, you are catapulted into the global politics of slavery. And in the deep end of that politic, it is extremely hostile. I can tell you, I have never in my life experienced such hostility than what I experienced in the UN context, in an intergovernmental dialogue on slavery. The hatred was palpable. This was October 2001. Sorry, August 2001. I'm going to come to that because the British delegation especially, and I wish to say the British delegation was led by Baroness Amos, who you all know is a very distinguished black British diplomat. And to hear the language that slavery was legal, should have been a crime but was not, within a discourse where you are engaging a person who phenotypically you would expect whose ancestors were slaves to say yes, you realize that it has nothing to do with ethnicity at all. It's about power, and it's about representations of power. And it's about the future. It's about crafting the future, because what the British government was in fact saying was that we're going to issue no apology for what we have done, because none is required by law. The implication being that the enslaved people and the ancestors are not entitled or deserving of an apology and a discourse about repairing the damage. Now, I came out of Durban and I gave a public debriefing lecture in Barbados on the campus. And I argued that the world is in very, very terrible moral shape on the question of race and dealing with the colonial period, and that the hatred that exists in the political circles of the world around the issues of the legacies of slavery and the conception of freedom and who's entitled to freedom and how freedom relates to history, that there is tremendous bitterness at the intergovernmental level. And I stated that something terrible is going to happen in the world. A few weeks later, we had 9/11. And I remember receiving a number of phone calls from the media seeking to link the conclusion of my lecture to the atrocity of 9/11. Now, one can go through that kind of experience again, and I can tell you, I would not wish personally to go through that experience again. Because what I experienced at Durban, I am sure is what our ancestors experienced when the Ku Klux Klan came for them. I'm sure it is what the Jewish people experienced when the Third Reich came for them. When power comes for you, and the intention of that power is to dispose of you, that is what I experienced in Durban, in the UN, dealing with the issue of freedom and the legacies of slavery. And so, narrowing this issue to the agency of Pan-Africanism, the challenge before us now is how to restore the historic links of political agency in the first instance between the Caribbean and West African governments. But the good news is, and this is my final comment, the good news is that while the governments of West Africa were taking those positions, next door to the Intergovernmental Forum was the Civil Society Forum, the NGO Forum. And the people of West Africa were passing resolutions unanimously in support of these positions, while the governments were in another forum opposing them. So we draw comfort from the fact that this is an issue on which the governments of West Africa did not represent the views of their citizens. The governments of West Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal especially, were not speaking on behalf of their citizens. They were speaking on behalf of themselves. And that is, of course, comforting. Also comforting to know that there were many NGOs out of Britain that stood firmly against the views of their own state. And therein lies some room within which we can reconceptualize the popularity of the ideas surrounding freedom and notions of reparatory justice emerging from this historical experience. I'm willing to answer any questions later on, but for now I will end there. Thank you very much.
We do, of course, have time for questions, and I'd like to encourage people to pose them. If I could only ask for people to introduce themselves upon asking questions so that we can receive some of the benefits of this workshop, which is to get to know one another. So please.
The question was basically in relation to how we situated East Africa with regard to the memory of Atlantic slavery and questions of traumatic memory inheritance. So, can you hear me? And so on and so forth. And I was very intrigued by where America stands in relation to East African slavery at the moment, given that you have President Barack Obama, who's from Kenya, who has an East African inheritance. And yet, as far as our profile in Britain seems to be anyway, he's remained remarkably silent, or kind of stood away from any specific engagement with how America should engage with its slavery inheritance. And I was wondering to what extent you thought that the silence of Obama, so there's a silence which you see running throughout all his writings as well. Dreams from My Father is a book distinguished by its peculiar aporias and ignorances around the inheritance of slavery. So I was just wondering what you thought the Caribbean's attitude towards Obama and East Africa was.
Well, one of the great jokes that circulated around the Caribbean in the last presidential election here was a statement attributed to Romney, in which he is quoted to have said that the presidential campaign, it was a very long race. It was a very, very, very long race. And as you would expect, in all very long races, the African won. I thought that was a brilliant joke. I mean, I think you guys are laughing, so but it's a brilliant joke. East Africans in long distance races. But we were impressed with the narrative of the Zimbabwe and also the Kenyan delegates who spoke about the role of the Caribbean in their own liberation struggles. As you know, the issues of of them all now are now coming to the fore in Britain. And I understand steps are being taken to issue an apology for the crimes committed against the human people in those circumstances. The Caribbean felt that Zimbabwe had been dealt an unfair hand by the Thatcher government. That we know. I was a student in the UK when Zimbabwe's independence was negotiated. And I followed that conversation very, very closely. I had an interest. We were students raising money for Zimbabwe liberation. And the deal was, we know, that Britain would support agricultural reform strategy if Mugabe were to leave the issue of land alone for 21 years. And he left it alone for 21 years. 21 years came, and the British government backed away from the battle. And thus, the conversations we have now with land. But how President Obama relates to all of this is interesting. I was very concerned with Colin Powell's interpretation. I was more concerned with Condoleezza Rice's interpretation. Their view that in the politics of slavery, that the United States sees this entirely as a domestic matter and that they are dealing with this within the context of the state. And the notion that 50 years of affirmative action represents a key element in the process of reparations, and therefore it's a domestic discourse not to be ventilated within the UN. And that was the position they took. I suspect that's the context within which Obama is also formulating his own views. I do not know. But it's an argument that has merit in and of itself. In the case of Britain, for example, what has been the steps taken by the British state to participate in repairing any of this historical damage? The British position is no apology, no reparations, no affirmative action, no recuperative strategy, because we did nothing wrong, it was legal, and which is a kind of head in the sand kind of position, but which is consistent with a history of using military power and other forms of power in a certain way. At the moment, I can safely say that most Caribbean governments are still intimidated by the British state on this question, on the question of freedom, slavery, and how to deal with this within the context of policy. I think most Caribbean governments are still practicing politics in the context of fear of reprisals from the British state on this subject. And so the notion of fear, which certainly was a key element in the lives of the enslaved people, fear of power and the retributive force of power.
But what reprisals? I mean, like economic reprisals.
Yeah. Primarily, most of these governments are vulnerable within the context of international agencies, worldwide, IMF, other global environments, security forces. There are all kinds of global negotiations in which small states participate and are dependent that can be punished. And the fair punishment is palpable. It's very much in the air of electoral politics. So the fear of the post-colonial state, the fear of the individual enslaved person in the face of power, is continuous in that conversation. But there's also at the same time individual governments that are willing to stand up and make the point and face the consequences, as there were enslaved people who stood up and faced the consequences. So there is structural continuity in the psychology of the interrelationships of enslavement with small states, post-colonial, post-slavery states, states that have emerged out of slave plantations, such as the Caribbean states, that have emerged out of slave societies. The issue of fair remains a feature of the politics, and that continues to be, is there. It narrows the possibility. And Caribbean societies are now preparing to take the reparations issue formally to the British government. It is now the beginning of a formal presentation to ask for a dialogue on this issue. But they are bracing themselves for the consequences, you see. They are bracing themselves for the consequences.
Let's take one more question. I don't know, if you want to simply enunciate.
Yes, I think I can speak. My name is Hal Langford. I'm a fellow here at the John Crow Brown Library this semester and a professor of history from SUNY Buffalo. I wanted to comment precisely on this notion of structural continuity in the light of the conversation that we're attempting to engage in today. It strikes me that if we think about this relationship between the state and civil society, both in terms of the colonial period and in terms of the experience you had in South Africa, we see a very clear way in which the memory of slavery and the practice of slavery can be seen as of a piece. In other words, in the early modern period, as states in Europe and colonial states progressively centralized, one of the issues is precisely how to face the problem of slavery, whether that's an issue of co-optation of those who might be critics or direct coercion of those who might struggle against it, and how that boundary between the state and civil society is challenged and in some ways the potential challenge against the state is disempowered over the course of the progressive years of centuries of slavery. It seems to me that the experience in South Africa is the same. When you talk about the civil society conference that was parallel to the state conference, sort of having an absolutely different perspective on these issues, but then the members of civil society who are being brought into the state are either attacked or co-opted. It seems to be there's a thread there that can help us understand how the very issues that are early modern are also post-colonial.
Absolutely, and I want you to imagine the Durban context in which academia, on the one hand, is pitted against the political on the other. But the political is also surrounded by and enforced and empowered by academia. So Durban, from a Caribbean perspective, was really a discourse between two categories of academics. The European states had their reinforcements of academics. So the Caribbean delegations were headed primarily by academics. So it is an inter-academic discourse to a certain extent. On the issue of continuity, one of the critical legal arguments used by the state academics, or the state-supported academics, lawyers, philosophers especially, was that slavery is now too remote an experience to be subject to any form of social, political, recuperative strategy. This is too remote. And in British law, the concept of remoteness places any activity outside the realm of any judicial activity. And therefore, the British delegation said, even if we are prepared to concede that the experiences of slavery, slave trade, were crimes, and their remoteness render them outside of the parameter of a contemporary political dialogue. And so the lawyers on the other side then had to test the concept of remoteness. What is remoteness? International law specifies that if an experience, an event, is within living memory, then the principle of remoteness is applied. Now, slavery was abolished in the Caribbean in the 1880s. The British will say they abolished their own slavery in the 1830s. But they will also have to concede that the British slave owners in the British colonies moved their enslaved people out of the British colonies into the Spanish colonies for another 50 years. So a large chunk of the enslaved people in Cuba were taken out to Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, and the British got another 50 years of slave labor after they had abolished their own slavery. Now, 100 years is 2 generations of living memory. And there are people in the Caribbean today whose parents were slaves. There are people in the Caribbean today whose grandparents were enslaved. And if your grandparents were enslaved and the living memories all around you, the remoteness principle disappears. And so the issue is really, or the issue was, it was almost like a tennis game. You hit your volley, we return it over the net. You hit yours, and we return it over the net. And this has gone on for 3 days. Argument, counter-argument, argument, counter-argument. And 3 days of that. And finally, it all came to a head when the evidence about freedom, about slavery, had mounted up in that room, had filled, the room was now filled with historical information. And historical information was overwhelming the political dialogue, so that the British state eventually retreated and said, okay, fine. We concede the history. We concede the history. We concede the legal issues. But it is not practical or feasible to bring it into contemporary politics, and the conversation is closed. The capacity to close the conversation is it's a powerful one, you know. You could say it's closed and it's closed. And that eventually is what happened. The conversation was closed by those who had about to close it.
I'm going to exercise that power differently here, which is to say we will come back to these issues and come back to Sir Hilary's observations at the end of our session. But I hope you'll please join me in thanking him for his presentation. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the second speaker on the program this morning, Reginaldo Ferreira, soon to be our new colleague here at Brown University with appointments in history and Portuguese and Brazilian studies. And if the grin on my face tells you anything, we are delighted with this news and delighted to welcome you here on a full-time basis come this July. For a few months more, he has to bear the burden of being an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Virginia. His much anticipated book, Cross-Cultural Exchange in the Atlantic World, Angola and Brazil During the Era of the Slave Trade, was published in 2012 by Cambridge University Press. Ferreira's work is distinguished, it seems to me, by its feats of archival discovery, as he's utilized collections in Africa, in Europe, and in South America to recover stories of Angolans in diaspora, stories that seemingly are impossible and yet exist and have been brought to light by his archival diligence. He moves easily across several centuries, seemingly as comfortable in the early modern period as in the 19th century. And this year, with a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities, he's been developing several new projects that deepen South Atlantic history and even make the crucial move of carrying that sort of project into the Indian Ocean basin and bringing it more towards a global perspective. We're delighted to have Reginaldo Ferreira with us today, and his talk is entitled Slave Flights and Runaway Communities in Angola, 17th to the 19th Centuries. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this warm presentation introduction. And what I'm going to do is, first of all, I want to say thank you for the organizers of this conference. It is a pleasure to be here, to be able to share my research with you all. And what I'm going to do is to split this presentation into 3 sections. So I'm going to divide it into a section that basically provides some background on Angola, particularly in relation to the broader Atlantic, in relation to the relationship with Brazil. And there are 2 questions here, 2 key words that are going to be guiding this presentation when it comes to this first section. The first word is bilateral relations. And by that I mean the fact that the relationship between Angola and Brazil was a relationship that was framed not by the triangular commerce, which is the conventional wisdom when it comes to other slave trades throughout the Americas, but it's a relationship in which Portugal was almost secondary or peripheral. The other key word here, or expression, to understand the magnitude of the slave trade to Brazil. We're talking about a slave trade that brought to Brazil a number that's probably 10 times higher or larger than the number of people brought to British North America, is the multi-dimensional nature of this relationship, which is something that I'm going to go back to that in a few minutes. The second section, it comprises of a critique of the historiography, a critique of the excessive focus on the slave trade and a particularly type of approach to the slave trade. An approach that, from my opinion, it leads us to gloss over the specificity or the issue of slave resistance in Africa specifically. The third section, it deals with slave flights and the formation of runaway communities in Central Africa, in Angola. And questions that are guiding this presentation, which is a presentation that grows out of a book that I'm working on now. The first question is, and this is provocative, I want to push this historiography to a new direction, so to speak. So the question is, does slave resistance in Angola in the 19th century, does it prevent the Portuguese from establishing themselves in Angola as a colonial power in the first half of the 19th century? That's the question. And the shortest answer to that is yes. The second question, which is also provocative, so to speak, has to do with the relationship between abolitionism, and by that I mean the abolition of the Angola slave trade, and slave resistance, and slave flights, and runaway communities. Can we reshape this field and try to understand abolitionism from the point of view of Africans, from a point of view that places Africans at the very center of their history, and thus breaking away from the Mainstream narrative of abolitionism, the conventional wisdom about abolitionism, that gives lots of attention to the Portuguese, to the British, to Brazil, in a sort of diplomatic and macrostructural top-down history that, again, glosses over individuality and African issues. So these are the 3 questions or the 3 sections of this presentation. Let me begin with Angola in the broader context of the slave trade. And by saying that Angola, together with Congo, accounted for roughly half of the slave trade. And by that I mean probably 6 million people of the 12 million people brought to the Americas came from that area. I'm not the only specialist in this room about these issues, okay? And this is going to sound a little bit redundant, and I have to apologize for that. But that's a background that's important to understand where I'm coming from here. Luanda and Benguela, the 2 main slave ports in Angola. These 2 regions regions, or these two cities, Portuguese cities, accounted for 30% of the overall slave trade to the Americans. And I guess the question here, and this is pretty obvious, what's behind this? What's driving this trade? A trade that's 10 times larger than the slave trade to the US. What's going on here? And I would say that the first way of understanding this is by emphasizing or highlighting the relationship between Angola and Brazil. Two Portuguese colonies here. And Brazil, as I pointed out before, Angola was very important in the slave trade. On the other hand, Brazil was by far the largest destination of the slave trade in the Americas. Half of the people brought to the Americans were taken to Brazil. And this is a relationship that's bilateral, as I pointed out before, which means that the commodities used to buy people, free people in Central Africa, these commodities are coming by and large from Brazil or via Brazil. And commodities here, by that I mean from alcohol to Indian textile, which is really the bulk of the commodities coming into Angola. Another key point when it comes to this relationship, which again, a bilateral relationship that intensifies the slave trade to Brazil. Another key point is the fact that the ships, the vessels, built to bring slaves from Angola or Central Africa to Brazil, they are not built in Portugal. Portugal, as I pointed out before, is really secondary. These vessels are built in Brazil. Logistically, and in terms of the organization of the slave trade, this is all being organized from Brazil. And the key point here as well, in addition to the logistics, in addition to the funding, is the creation of personal ties and cultural ties, social ties across the Atlantic. Which takes us back to the point that I made before about a multidimensional relationship, which is shaped by the slave trade, but it goes beyond that. I'm talking about slave dealers that had families in both sides of the Atlantic. This is very important, for example, in the context of abolitionism in the 19th century, because it allows them to bypass abolitionism, to evade abolitionism. And by doing that, that means that the slave trade lasts longer in Angola, in Central Africa, because of this multidimensional nature of the slave trade. So let me move on to what I'm calling here a historiographical critique or historiographical note. And I want to begin by taking issue with a statement recently issued by French historian Olivier Petre-Grenouillot, who wrote, and I'm quoting here, "Unlike the case of the Americans, no real interest has been manifested for resistance and the role of agents of the slaves in relation to internal forms of slavery, ending quote, in Africa." This assessment is quite bleak and doesn't really reflect the historiography on resistance to slavery and the slave trade in Africa. I did a quick search on the library online data set, and I came up with several studies of slave resistance in Africa, from Lovejoy to Martin Klein to Sylviane Diouf and other people. So I guess for us to say that, historians are not or have never been interested in slave resistance in Africa, it is an overstatement, and I'm being very diplomatic here. However, we ought to agree that the scholarship on slave revolts in Africa is much smaller than the scholarship on slave revolts in the Americas. That we cannot deny. And in my view, we have three factors at play here to understand this imbalance. First, the difficulties of identifying, finding sources throughout the Atlantic, funding and all that. So it makes it very complicated to find sources, for example, to understand what went on in Angola, in Congo in the 19th century. So that would be a first factor at play. Second, this situation, it grows out of the relative paucity of studies on pre-colonial African history. If we look at the situation now in terms of intellectual output on African history, the bulk of the production, the bulk of the historiography really deals with colonial African history. So pre-colonial African history lags behind colonial and post-colonial African history, which means that it is inevitable and to some extent understandable this lack of robust historiography on slave revolts in Africa. A third point is, in my view, related to the excessive focus on the slave trade and the type of interpretation of the slave trade that is primarily focused on numbers. So, which means that, or them, trading networks, that means that we know a lot about the overall number of people brought to the Americas. I could give you all the breakdown here, the specificity, where people were coming from, exactly when, how long it lasted the trade. But this is a historiography that tells us nothing about real people, okay? It's very frustrating. I know about that because I collected data for these big data sets. And that's when I became so frustrated that I decided to break away from that altogether and write a type of micro-history that accounts for people's real lives. Now, this critique, it is particularly true when it comes to Angola, which is a region where, shockingly, only 3 articles have dealt or have been written on slave revolts in the past, perhaps 30 years. And yet, I would argue that Angola provides an ideal setting to analyze a set or a list of very important issues, namely the relationship between slave resistance and the slave trade, the relationship between slave resistance and the abolition of the slave trade, and I think there is a central connection between the two things, and the relationship between slave resistance and the establishment of colonialism in the 19th century. In 1860s, Sebastião Lopes de Calheiros e Menezes, this is a Portuguese governor of Angola. He provided a telling example of the relationship between slave resistance and the economic colonialism that the Portuguese were trying to establish at the time, first half of the 19th century. According to the governor, Angolan commercial agriculture, and the Portuguese were very invested in creating a plantation system there. But according to the governor, and I'm quoting here, this agriculture would never, or agricultural system would never, quote, be as productive as in São Tomé, Havana, Brazil, or the United States, because blacks can easily escape slavery. End quotation here, or citation. I will go back to this point in a few minutes, but I want to say that, in fact, by the time that Governor Calheiros issued this remark, slave flights had become a key feature to Angolan society for a very long time. If we go back to the 17th century, 300 years earlier than the time when Governor Calheiros analyzed the situation in Angola, we find that, for example, many runaway slaves would flee from or escape from Rwanda to join the Indongo, the Queen Njinga army fighting the Portuguese. This is first half of the 17th century. And clearly, the ethnic background here of these people, they shared the commonality on an ethnic background that mattered a lot. It allowed them, it facilitated this process of escaping slavery in Luanda and joining these forces fighting the Portuguese. So in addition to people escaping Portuguese or Atlantic slavery and going back to the interior, we also find people going back from Luanda, Benguela, and the environs of these regions back to the Kingdom of Congo. And the Portuguese would actually use that as a justification to wage wars against the Kingdom of Congo. Another point that illustrates the pervasiveness of slave flights and the formation of runaway communities in Angola is the place of Kisama, which is a region that's not far at all from Rwanda, but it's basically an independent region controlled by these runaway people that were able to create communities that remained basically independent from the Portuguese well into the 19th century. So this begs the question. The fact that slavery was, or slave resistance, or slave flights was really part of the daily life of the colonial system in Angola. And the question is, how can we explain the high incidence of slave flights and formation of runaway communities in Angola? In my view, we have at least 3 or 4 issues at play here. The first one is the fact that a lot of the people brought by the Portuguese, brought from the interior to work in Luanda and Benguela and regions around these cities. A lot of these people were people, again, free people, but sometimes also people who had been working or living under regimes of personal dependence. Now, from the Portuguese documentation, we know these different regimes of personal dependence or labor, forced labor as well. We know them, we classify them as slavery. And there is a problem here, because there is a key distinction between what was going on in the interior, what was going on in these societies that had these different regimes of personal dependence and sometimes forced labor, and the sort of Atlantic slavery, I'm going to call that Atlantic slavery, that the Portuguese were trying to establish on the coast. There's a key distinction here. In these regimes on these societies in the interior, whoever was living under these arrangements, which I have called personal dependence, this person, she or he, could transfer or look for someone else to work for or to live with. There is malleability and flexibility here, and reversibility as well, which we don't find in Atlantic slavery. As these people are brought to work for the Portuguese, my point is there was a cultural and natural inclination to escape slavery. And I have a quotation here, a citation that's particularly insightful to illustrate my point. In the 1850s, another Portuguese governor of Angola, he states, his name is Adrião Acácio da Silveira, he states, and I quote, "Blacks had a natural and to some extent, to some degree, excusable inclination to escape slavery." He is clearly referring to slavery in regions under Portuguese control. So another way of understanding, another way of really understanding why slave resistance or slave flights, why they were so persistent and pervasive, is the issue of the slave trade. The fact that between being brought to the Americas and staying in Africa, for Africans, it looked like, it seemed like the latter, or the second option was better. So the slave trade is really the thing that triggers slave revolts, okay, slave resistance. And by saying that, basically, I'm following John Thornton here. That's a point that has been made by him. But at the same time that I agree with that, I think there is a space for us, there is room for us to challenge that connection. And by challenging that connection, I believe we should go back and look specifically what's going on in Angola, particularly in the 19th century. And this is not to deny the importance of the slave trade in terms of causing or prompting slave revolts or slave flights in Angola. This is a connection that, from the point of view of Africans, for them, they would equate, and we find graphic reports of that, they would equate the slave trade with white cannibalism. So the slave trade for them, it means not only uprooting, it means not only being taken away from their communities, but the way that they rationalize that on an emotional level, and again, graphic reports about that, not only in Rwanda, but also in Kasanje, in the interior, showing that people would equate the slave trade with white cannibalism in the Americas. But I would argue, and this is basically to bring me to my last point here, because I know I'm almost running out of time. My point is that, in addition to that, we have to look at what's going on in Angola, particularly in the 19th century, when the Portuguese tried to establish a plantation system there, in the 1830s, 1840s. And the number of slaves, the slave population of these places, but Portuguese Angola, grows a lot. And people were then put to work on farms. They were put to work under conditions that resemble conditions in the Americas. And this is a turning point because not only we see a systematic effort by the Portuguese, but we also see the number of cases or episodes of slave flights. A slave population that's growing up, a systematic effort to phase in or to create a plantation system. And this is my last point that I will not have time to really develop that here, but we can talk about that during the Q&A section. My point, based on extensive, massive documentation, is that by proposing this plantation system, by escaping slavery in Portuguese Angola, the runaway slaves, fugitives, they were able to delay the establishment of a more entrenched system of colonialism in that region. Thank you very much.
Questions? Bring this over.
Not a question for Ronaldo. I just wanted to say that listening to this research, which is tremendously important, reminds me of also the importance of a parallel source to help people understand the importance of the issues that you bring to light in terms of historiography. And I was just thinking about some of the novels by Angolan writers, which go into this period in a way that, for those who don't read Angolan novels, or they're not translated yet, would be very important as an auxiliary or a complementary source. So I was thinking, for example, of Pepetela's play, A Revolta da Casa dos Ídolos, The Revolt of the House of the Idols, which talks about the destruction of the, let's just say the indigenous Congo religious religious and philosophical structure by attempting to destroy the items of religious worship and the spaces of religious worship. And this is at the time when Congo is converting to Catholicism. And the second one is another novel by Pipitella. I'm just picking Pipitella from various. A Gloriosa Familia. And that one is about these family ties across the Atlantic between Brazil and Angola. And he picks a particular family, Brazilian, Afro-Brazilian Portuguese family in the two cities, and traces, particularly in the time of, from Dutch Angola, but also Portuguese Angola. And it's a long, thick novel, very interesting. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you.
I saw another hand, please.
Yeah, I don't need to be over enthusiastic and take a second shot here, but I find the talk fascinating, and it just strikes me that we have a lot more that we need to know about the question of slave flight as a connecting tissue between Brazil and Angola, or the West African slave trade in general. I mean, we know, of course, that the term quilombo has its African origins. We know that slaves, as they ran away in Brazil, recreated African traditions, perhaps even African dwellings and hierarchies in those quilombos. But I wonder if you might, based on your research, suggest other kinds of problems that we might get at if we looked more closely at the issues of slave flight in Brazil and slave flight in Angola or elsewhere in West Africa, more together as a piece.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Both are remarking the question. I don't specifically work on Brazil, but I'm very much familiar with the historiography on Brazil, particularly the idea that the Quilombo of Palmares and the whole idea of Quilombos is inspired by Central African traditions. And I'm very familiar with the work by Schwartz, but not only that, there is a scholar in Brazil now at Unicamp, Silvia Lara, that's writing a book on that as well. So I find that very promising. Now, I think the next step is, in addition to analyzing the migration, so to speak, the traveling of traditions, is really to establish comparisons. To understand patterns of slave revolt or slave flights in Minas Gerais, for example, the region you work on, and the Luanda hinterland, and a bottom-up type of interpretation that moves us beyond the fixation that sometimes that is in Brazil about tradition and how traditions migrated from Africa to Brazil, which I agree that they did, by the way. But I just want to understand what real people were doing on the ground. And I think by writing history, comparative histories, Angola, Brazil, I think it would take us a long way in terms of having a better understanding of slave resistance in the broader South Atlantic.
Thanks very much for those remarks, really. Thank you. And as you were speaking, the thought that came to me really emerges out of us work that a student has just done, a thesis, and he's somewhere in the room, Michael Becker, in which the argument is very well documented, extremely well documented, about the ways in which in the late 1700s in Haiti, we know that there were 50 to 60, depending on whoever figure you want to use, of the slaves came from Central Africa. That there was a kingdom which has been called Kingdom of Platon that was actually founded on the southern part of the island. And that kingdom in the end had about 3,000 slaves, ex-slaves, in a kind of quasi-maroon community, flight, And then when they were destroyed, they kind of dispersed and joined the Revolutionary Army and caused problems in the Revolutionary Army itself and so on. But what struck me was for us to begin to think about comparative histories. You made a point about Brazil, but comparative histories across the Atlantic, not just in Brazil, about this question of flight and fugitiveness. And how can we begin to think about fugitiveness in relationship to larger questions of freedom? Because these fugitive communities constructed in whatever ways they could some ideas of freedom, some what I like to call practices of freedom. And so one of the things that we might want to begin to think about is coming out of this sort of thing is how can we put together clusters of scholars where 50% is not done? Where we do the 100, what Professor Gusta called 50, we don't do 50%. In other words, we do 50% here because that's your specialty. I may do 50% over here because that's my specialty. But the question of trying to put together the whole and the connections, right? And then trying to think through really theoretically and historically what these things really mean and how then that may shape, in fact, an entire history of what I like to call colonial modernity. And so I just want to make that comment, and thanks for that.
Absolutely, and I think the center provides a unique avenue to achieve that kind of interpretation. It's very promising, to the extent that we can bring together people who come from different traditions, that have different training too. That are trained outside the U.S. That's very important. So we could certainly develop that kind of interpretation that's truly Atlantic, and that moves beyond macro history and accounts for individuality and for real people.
All right. Please join me in thanking Professor Ferrer for his presentation today. As we move to the final presentation in this session, I'm going to put a challenge upon all of you to begin thinking about how to piece these three talks together. I just want to ask you to begin to look for some commonalities, to look for some convergences and some fruitful spaces of cross-fertilization as we really try to think through the theme of this session, freedom on my mind. And to bring us to the final stage of this, our final speaker in this session is Alejandro de la Fuente, the UCIS research professor at University of Pittsburgh, whose history department, if you've ever had a chance to look at that webpage, boasts probably the strongest concentration of Atlanticists, particularly with focus on the African slave trade, that you will find anywhere in this country. It is such a stunningly strong department, and I'm very envious of the conversations that you all must have. Professor de la Fuente is the author of several works of Cuban history, including 2008's Havana and the Atlantic in the 16th Century, and 2001's A Nation for All, Race, Inequality, and Politics in 20th Century Cuba. So here too is a scholar of tremendous chronological range, as well as a scholar of tremendous intellectual range, addressing subjects ranging from early modern legal practices to contemporary art, and doing so in a lengthy list of book chapters and articles. It's really quite impressive. His talk today is entitled Slaves and the Making of Slave Law. Please join me in welcoming Alejandro de la Fuente.
Thank you, Seth, for your kind introduction, and to Tony Bogues for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to use the opportunity to present something that is very much a work in progress about issues of slaves and the law. I've been working for too many years, probably now, on a book on slaves and the law in colonial Cuba. It's a way of sort of pushing A Nation for All, which is a book about race and politics in 20th century Cuba back in time, and also doing some comparative work on the development of slave legal regimes in the Americas with my colleague from the University of Southern California, American legal scholar Ariela Gross. We have been working on a book comparing the development of legal regimes in Cuba, Louisiana, and Virginia over time. And one of the questions that we have frequently have been forced to deal with is what exactly is slave law? What do we mean by slave law? And what did contemporaries mean by slave law? Which statutes, regulations, precepts, principles, customs inform the legal reasoning of colonial officials and the legal strategies and initiatives of slaves in places like colonial Cuba, and how did those slave initiatives in turn shape, transform the very customs and the very legal principles that they were invoking to try to make their lives better, and perhaps to even escape slavery altogether. This isn't just an academic question, of course, because whenever colonial officials were forced to deal with a slave demand, they had to answer this very question, which was, which law could they use to either grant or to deny that demand? Exactly, they had to offer some legal reasoning and some legal foundation to their answers and to their administrative responses. To mention a notable example of this, in the preface to a very well-known royal instruction on the education, labor, and treatment of slaves in 1789, famous Real Cédula sobre el trato de los esclavos. This is a royal cédula that was probably never completely enforced, but it was passed and approved by the King, Charles IV. In the preface to this, to that royal instruction, the King made reference to the utter confusion that surrounded the whole issue of slave law, stating that it was basically impossible for his slave-owning subjects to comply with the law because there were so many different types of regulations that they could be used. He mentions in the preface to the royal instruction from las siete partidas to the multitude of royal cédulas approved by the kings since the 16th century. And on top of that, the literally hundreds of police regulations, ordenanzas, reglamentos, bandos, that different colonial officials and courts had approved across time and across the empire since the 16th century. We are talking truly about a massive amount of regulations concerning slavery by the 18th century. The royal instruction of 1789 was supposed to put an end to this confusion. It didn't, of course, but that's another story. Now, despite these ambiguities, despite this confusion that even the king acknowledged, commentators on Spanish colonial slavery spoke frequently of the law and of Spanish colonial law concerning slavery. So I wanted to share one quote with you, which is easier if I show it to you. Thank you, please. Taken from a book published in London, 1774, by Reverend John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, of course, who was making a comment on the enlightenment of Spanish regulations concerning slavery and asking for those regulations to be applied or transferred to the British colonies. I'm going to quote, "We have accounts from England of some regulations that have taken place in the Spanish colonies, which do the Spaniards much honor and are certainly worthy of our imitation. They are to the following effect. As soon as a slave is landed, his name, price, etc. are registered in a public register, and the master is obliged by law to allow him 1 working day every week to himself besides Sundays, so that if the slave chooses to work for his master on that day, he receives the wages of a free man for it. And whatever he gains by his labor on that day is so secure to him by law that the master cannot deprive him of it. As soon as the slave is able to purchase another working day, the master is obliged to sell it to him at a proportionable price, this 1/5 part of his original cost. and so likewise the remaining 4 days at the same rate, as soon as the slave is able to redeem them, after which he is absolutely free. This is such encouragement to industry that even the most indolent would be tempted to exert themselves. Men who have thus worked out their freedom are inured to the labor of the country and are certainly the most useful subjects that a colony can acquire. Now, if we look around to try to find this law in any of the traditional sources of Spanish colonial law concerning slavery, you will quickly discover that such law, in fact, did not exist. There is nothing like this included in the traditional codes of Castile. Nothing in the codes of Castile would make reference to the type of obligations and entitlements that Reverend Wesley is talking about. Nor would Roman law be of any help here. Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis contains no legal figure that would be even roughly comparable to the kind of obligations and entitlements described by Wesley. A previous generation of scholars used to emphasize that the sources of slave law were basically two sources. One was the Spanish traditional codes, las siete partidas and such, and through them Roman law. And then all the royal enactments or the regulations passed by the kings since the 16th century. This is the position that people like Herbert Klein or a legal historian like Alan Watson have proposed. Now, if we look into those sources, we would never be able to understand this law. But you will probably agree with me that it is also unlikely that the Reverend was completely delusional, right? Something must have existed for him to write this. Some regulations, as he says in the text, must have existed. Some obligations and entitlements, some practices must have existed that he was able to speak about this law. So in a sense, I think the challenge of us as historians of slavery, and the law, is to try to peek behind this. Not just to dismiss it. Dismiss it would be very simple, right? To say, this makes no sense, there is nothing like this, you cannot find it in Las Partidas, you cannot find a royal cedula, end of the story. But we do have the text. Can we try to make sense of that law? Wesley's account contains 4 specific claims, 4 quite remarkable claims. First, that slave prices in the Spanish colonies became notarized. That once they became notarized and registered, they were fixed for the purposes of manumission. Second, that by law, whichever law that is, slaves were entitled to 1 working day per week other than Sundays. Paradise, right? Third, that whatever the slave earned on that day belonged to him or her, also by law, and could not be taken away. And fourth, that the slave had the right, not conditional on master's will, the right to purchase portions of his time, work days, right? By paying a portion of that price that had been registered before, that had been notarized. And this was a right that masters could not limit. The master, Wesley says, is obliged to sell it to him. Wesley was probably making reference to a very special type, a very special legal category of slaves that existed in some of the Spanish colonies since the 16th century. And that is the category of esclavos coartados, or coartado slaves. These were slaves who had agreed with their masters, with their owners, on a manumission price that was notarized and fixed, and that then made partial payments towards their freedom. then began to make payments towards their freedom. A central element of this institution, coartación, which is a rather fuzzy, vague, poorly defined, highly contested institution, an institution which owed much to slaves' initiatives and to slave strife, was the invariability of the price. One can understand why, after a slave managed to make a deal, make an agreement with the master in terms of manumission price, he or she would want that price to be notarized somewhere so that the master would not be able to change it later. Now, this practice, the practice of establishing a fixed negotiated price for self-purchase, is recorded and it can be demonstrated empirically in Cuba and in other colonial Spanish colonial territories since the 16th century. A royal cedula, this is probably what Wesley is talking about. This is probably the regulations that Wesley is talking about. A royal cedula of 1768 gave this practice some rather vague legal foundation and recognition, because it stated that sale prices could be used or were to be used as manumission prices if slaves were able to come up with the whole amount to purchase their freedom. Now, it's highly unlikely, and it was of course very hard for any slave to really master his whole price to purchase freedom. But the royal cedula got imposed on the traditional practices of coartación, by which slaves would agree on a fixed price, and instead of buying their whole freedom, something that they rarely could do, they would make partial payments towards it. And here then gets the whole question about portions and about control, about whether slaves are entitled to 1 day or 2 or more. Legal experts, jurists, and colonial officials and masters had to deal with the following situation. What did it mean in legal terms and in practical social terms when a slave had purchased, let's say, half of his or her freedom? What exactly is that? Is that a half-free person? A half-enslaved person? Is it somebody who is entitled to control half of his or her time, as Wesley is suggesting? Or did he or she purchase an arm, 1 ear, and 1 leg? Exactly what does it mean? If my reading of the evidence is correct, and as I said before, this is very much a work in progress, slaves made attempts to link partial payments toward freedom with partial control over their time and labor, which is not surprising. Once they had paid a portion of their manumission price, they claimed the right to have a portion of their labor and a portion of their time that was proportional to the payment that they had made. And many slave contracts since the 16th century acknowledge this reality. And I want to share just a couple of examples with you. This is one sale contract of a slave named Juana. We don't know much about Juana. She is described as a mulata, a mulatto slave. She was probably Creole, which would mean born in Cuba. And this is the language of the contract. I quote, "Concerning this sale, it is only on half of the said mulatto woman, on the said mulata. The buyer must use her in the same form, and if he uses her whole service, he must grant her half of the time that belongs to her and discount it from her price." End of the quote. Another variant of the same problem is exemplified by another contract, this one from 1590, in which the buyer of a woman, who is described as a cortada, agreed to discount 4 ducados monthly from her manumission price in order to enjoy her whole services. In other words, here the buyer is making a payment towards manumission every month in order to use the slave, the whole services of the slave. So in these cases, the slaves had acquired control over some of their own time and their own labor. Is this a law? Well, in this particular aspect, the law, as referenced by Wesley, was, if anything, a very contentious and very contested law. Because, of course, masters frequently went to court to say, yes, she or he has made payments, but I'm still the owner, and property rights are absolute. They're not, and they do have foundation in Spanish law, and they could mobilize very serious arguments on their behalf. Perhaps nobody put it better than a Cuban lawyer who was litigating many of these cases against slaves in 1830. He said, I quote, "Some slave representatives have attempted to alleviate slavery so as to pretend to concede a half of their time to slaves who are bound in service of their masters when they have paid half of their value. But this opinion is not in conformity with the law. Coartación was not established to reduce slavery into halves, but only to prevent any alteration in the price of slaves." End of the quote. Now, the fact that there is a lawyer making this case and arguing this case against slaves is perhaps the best illustration that slaves managed to push these cases into the courts, and that the courts frequently found their arguments compelling and found in favor of them. It is interesting that by the early 19th century, several royal regulations refer to non-coartado slaves, to slaves who are not subject to coartación, as enteros, complete slaves, as if acknowledging that there is some category out there of slaves who are not entirely slaves. They're esclavos en parte or something like that. This designation suggests that coartados were only partially enslaved, or as a local official reported in 1826, that coartados, I quote, "not being free, can barely be called slaves," end of the quote. It is also interesting that the practice of coartación was initially known as cortarse. Cortarse in Spanish means to divide up, to cut into pieces. It's the action by which slaves were cutting their price into portions and making payments toward that price. By the late 18th century, the practice is known as coartar, which in Spanish means to limit, to hindrance, to reduce. So what had begun as a slave action, cortarse, had become a limitation, a hindrance on master's power by the late 18th century. And here, the dictionaries of the Royal Academy of Language, of Spanish language, are beautiful. You can follow how the term changes across the 18th century. Over time, slaves' actions had become a constraint on master's dominion. To make it even more interesting, by the mid-19th century, that practice, the practice of attempting to link partial payments toward freedom with partial control over time and labor, was being recognized in written law. Several reglamentos, several ordinances passed by authorities in Cuba and Puerto Rico that I know of make reference to this practice and give it a legal foundation in written law that they didn't exist before. So let me just close with a couple of thoughts about this. We need to think about, I'm sorry to complicate things with this intermediate category, but here we have a group of African slaves and their descendants who have managed somehow to use the legal, legal figures to create a category and a social space that was never envisioned by the law. And on top of that, they managed to have those practices. They forced colonial authorities to deal with those practices and to come up with legal solutions to them. Some people were referring to those practices as law by the late 18th century. In her magnificent book, Law and Colonial Cultures, Lauren Benton argues that in terms of sources, I'm going to quote, the law of slavery of the Southern Atlantic is uncomplicated. Both Portuguese and Spaniards adopted legal statutes that were derived with relatively minor change from Roman law, end of the quote. I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear that I respectfully disagree. Because any analysis of the sources of slave law that stays with Roman law, or with the Siete Partidas, or with the written royal cedulas will never be able to make sense of this law, which is a law that is actually affecting the lives of real people, and that real people are producing through their actions. We must incorporate, and this would be my proposal, those actions and those demands. These are the actions of the enslaved and the demands of the enslaved into any discussion of slave law. And that makes their study incredibly complicated, in fact, not only because we need to reconstruct these social worlds, but because by doing that, we also need to incorporate into our thinking about slave law in the Americas the legal notions, the notions of fairness, justice, reciprocity, duties, obligations that these slaves brought with them from Africa. We now need to incorporate into any discussion of slave law also those perceptions, also those expectations that slaves brought into the mix. Benton may think that this is complicated. It sounds terribly complicated to me. Perhaps that's why I haven't been able to finish that book yet. Thank you.
Questions for Professor De La Fuente? Joanne, do you want to speak loudly?
I will. Joanne Mellon. I'm wondering if there are situations you have found where multiple owners of a slave, where there are multiple owners of a slave and one of them gives up his ownership, his property rights, and what happens in that situation. There are several of those, one of them being Moses Brown, who gives up all of his slaves, and then the part he owns of a couple, Nathaniel Green, another Quaker. I've always sort of treated that with my students as though, well, does the guy feel a quarter free, and really never thought about it. I simply thought about the fact that there's no implication for the slave. But this leads me to think maybe there is. What happens when there are multiple owners and one of them gives up his full property rights, but other owners have partial rights in the slave?
So I have seen cases like this. And what happens is that what you find in subsequent contracts, sales contracts, is that there is reference, that one portion of the manumission price has been paid, the portion that used to belong to X or Y, but that still there are three other owners or two other owners who have claims on these slaves' body, labor. So when the sale happens, it then happens like the case that I mentioned here. The part that has been taken care of, if it is associated with one owner, is excluded from the sale, which of course sounds very neat, but it's anything but, right? We're talking about one human being here, of whom 2/3 are being sold.
So is there a reduction in work?
There is a reduction in work. So some of the contracts make reference to the fact that there is a reduction in work, that the new buyers cannot use the slave as if it was entero, as if it was an entire slave. But how that gets worked out in practice is to me, is the truly fascinating things. In some cases, you see the buyer saying, okay, I'll use this slave as if it was entero, but I'm going to make payments every month towards manumission. I'm going to be paying for the portion that I do not own, That's the example of 1590, the owner paying 4 ducados a month, which is not a small amount. He's basically paying for about half of this slave. So he's going to use that slave for a couple of years, and after that, that slave is going to complete payments. And the price is fixed, has been notarized, has been registered, cannot be changed. Now, there are also many cases of litigation among owners about who gets to own which portion of the slave. But that happened also, as you know well, with many slaves who were not cuartados. It's just a property litigation. That happens a lot. That's less interesting to me because it's the most traditional thing that we always find. The slave as just property.
I don't think this is going to reach, so just stand up.
Thank you. The question I have is whether it would be productive to think about the slave's body as being separated in different portions, right? Where a persona mixta, where this notion of the body and labor are held by the master, right? But it seems to me that what we're talking about is the notion of the freedom is held by some other, the state potentially, which kind of links this question of legality. So as the body and this labor are functioning and generating revenue, the question of freedom has already been taken off the table because that's the reason why the body can function and generate labor, right? So then there's some negotiation between, as those things start drawing together, as there's an accumulation of revenue from this labor that then gets attributed or collected by some entity that then the state accepts as diminishing their hold on the freedom, then that freedom then gets reconstituted to the body and the labor becomes the ownership of the body. Because it seems to me that this question of how the separation of the labor is only interesting, or ownership of the labor still requires that the person's still enslaved, right? So the enslaved condition is separate from the question of the body and labor. So the question I would have is legally, where do we find the kind of ordainment and establishment of the notion of the state owning the freedom rather than property rights, which seem to me to be obvious if you think about the slave as a type of animal or production of labor.
But in practice, how you work that out is fairly complicated because I agree with you that one way to think about this is that this person is still a slave no matter what, right? He's still enslaved, even though a portion of his, or more typically hers actually, manumission price has been paid. But when a slave makes the claim that he or she has the right, he's not asking for a concession, he's not asking for a grace of the master. He is saying, I have paid half, and therefore I'm entitled to do X, Y, and Z. Then the whole concept of slavery and enslavement the whole issue is questioned. Because here, slavery is based, as property owners, as slave owners frequently said in court, is based on the absolute dominion, on the absolute control. And what this does is to break that control in two ways. First is that slaves manage to impose on the courts the notion that they have the right to make payments towards freedom. This is something that is not contingent on the generosity or the good soul of the master. That by itself makes a crack, right? At the whole notion of what slavery and enslavement is supposed to be. And if addition to that, that person by making a partial payment is able to claim the right, I never like to say has the right because it doesn't have anything. What it has is the opportunity to enter into a conversation with colonial officials and say, a conversation that colonial officials will listen to, will engage in, and will consider that and say, yeah, maybe this is a right, maybe because this person has paid. So, which is why a Cuban jurist, fairly famous Cuban jurist, very concerned with this issue in the mid-19th century, said coartación is ultimately incompatible with slavery. It's not because the number of coartados were very large. We're not talking about numbers here. It's not a question that there's a whole generation of previous generation of Cuban scholars who used to debate if there were 45 or 68 coartados. That's hardly the problem. The problem is that masters feel, and rightly so, that coartación is undermining enslavement as a legal, and slavery as a legal category in fundamental ways. I didn't mention it here, but one of the rights that many of these slaves claim after making the payment is the right to change owners at will. And if their owner doesn't allow them to do that, then they claim mistreatment because the owner is not allowing them to find a better owner. So again, it's not that these slaves had that right, it is that they're able to claim new rights once they enter into this relationship. Does that answer your question?
I recognize that there are numerous other questions for Professor De La Fuente, but we have about 20 minutes left, and I think it probably behooves us to use the remaining time to open up a more general conversation that will involve all of the panelists here. So I hope you'll indulge and maybe reserve some of the specific questions for the informal time that will follow this session, and maybe we can devote our attention here to some of the broader themes. If you'll allow me to open that up, it seems that one of the threads that runs through the three talks today is state power, and thinking more, recognizing more about the role of the state in setting the sort of terrain upon which enslaved people and their descendants struggle for recognition, for rights, for the possibilities of freedom itself. And I'm wondering, as the three of you have thought about the way sort of scholarly conversations have taken place, particularly around sort of this notion of freedom on my mind, around the agency, the aspiration of enslaved people and African people in diaspora, whether attention to the state has been played down and whether it seems worthwhile to devote a more full throttle kind of scholarly attention to the state as a key factor in possibilities or lack thereof.
I've been volunteered. I do believe that the fundamental continuity across our papers treats with what I call the three L's. Life, which is what the purchasing of slavery and persons is all about, the right to own their life. Labor, and how one separates and discusses the labor of an enslaved person as opposed to the ownership of the life of an enslaved person, and the legacies of it all. The legacies, which my paper speaks to the ownership of the legacy, and what to make of that legacy in the context of international politics, international law. And we are bound together in a common discourse. I am fascinated by the way in which the attempts to parcel out the property rights in labor take shape in terms of democratizing access to property, where the labor of a person can be shared by many groups. But the fundamental question which you raise is about what do you purchase when you go to the auction? My own reading of the slave laws has been that what separates slavery from other forms of servitude indentured servitude, especially contracted indenture, is the issue of life and labor. That you are contracting to purchase access to the labor of a person over a specified period of time, which is a kind of servitude, as opposed to the purchase of the person's life, which is you own their right to life, and the enslaved person has no right to life. That is the issue, you have no right to life. And that is the core issue, in my judgment, in terms of how one understands what slavery is about. It's almost a kind of one's life is commuted on behalf and owned by someone else. You can then do with that whatever you want. But the issue is oftentimes complicated in the area of reproduction. Two persons get together and they have a child. The owner of the father of the man is a different person to the owner of the woman who owns the child. In all of the jurisdictions that I've seen, the property rights pass through a specific process. It's the owner of the mother, and that is how the legal issues involved of reproduction of property rights, it passes through the female. I'm not sure if, I have never seen a case of the child being broken out into packages of ownership. It goes conclusively and exclusively to the owner of the mother. But the political discussion over the legacy, which is my conversation in Durban, treats with precisely the issue of who has the right to interpret this history and who has the right to interpret this legacy. What the UN conference at Durban concluded, in effect, is that the states that invested in the construction of these slave systems reserve the right to define the nature of that experience and therefore to control the political consequences of that circumstance, which is the issue of power and how power continues through legacy. And so when the governments of Europe then say, we constructed systems which we legalize, we constructed systems which we own and manage, and all of the contemporary political discussions around that history, we will also determine the outcome of that. Then you see life, labor, and legacy in a continuous conversation. And that is what I take from what I've heard thus far. Thank you.
Don't you think there's an important sense that we're also fighting not just what you're quite rightly stressing, this what I think you termed, states capacity to bury its head in the sand. But parallel to that, and maybe even more dangerous, is this inscription of counter mythologies, which obfuscate even the necessity of thinking about what slavery was, by which I mean the heroes of abolition, for example. And in a culture which was a slave culture, we invest everything in a myth of emancipation at the expense of ever thinking about what the realities of slavery were. And that's also an incredibly effective ruse, isn't it?
In fact, one of the important issues that has not yet, in my judgment, been studied effectively is the underlying principle of emancipation, where the slave owners were compensated. But if you read carefully the discourse in the British Parliament, and by extension other parliaments that also approve compensation for slave owners for the loss of their property, the underlying principle in the British case was that it is the enslaved that should pay the compensation. Because under law, the beneficiary of an action is responsible for the compensation. And so the British government very nicely used a very interesting kind of political segue to say, but since we know that the enslaved cannot pay, we know they do not have the money to pay their owners for their emancipation, we will pay on their behalf. So that the money is paid to the slave owners as compensation was actually paid on the law instruction to the Treasury on behalf of the enslaved, which was fascinating. So
But what the British had then purchased was moral capital, to use Chris Brown's term. In other words, the moral high ground. Is it something you can forget about, what the prehistory of slavery was?
And indeed, but the linkages continue to bubble up. When the research project at London University drew to the attention of the British Prime Minister that his great-great-grandfather received £3 million in compensation for his 202 enslaved Africans in Jamaica, and that £3 million was used to purchase a state home, which has passed down to him, and he is now the Prime Minister in a property and a legacy that came out of his Jamaican slave owner ancestor. What do you have to say about this? His position was very blunt. He says, I have absolutely no comment to make on that. So again, it's a head in the sand, it's a closure. And of course, you extend that to the royal family, the list of the inventory and the asset base of a monarch, and all of these properties out of slave investments. And then you ask yourself, what role does the state itself play in all of this? The British government compensated itself for the slaves which it owned. And so the instruction to the Treasury to pay the compensation at the current values for the fallen persons, the government itself received its own compensation because the government owned thousands of slaves. So it passes the law on the one hand, collects the revenue on the other hand. So we're not speaking simply about private individuals in pursuit of their market choices. We're speaking of governments actually managing, owning, and operating these systems as well. And therefore, they are very keen to protect the legacy of interpretation because they were owners. They were not just managers and fiscal regulators. They were owners of the systems.
Let me jump in and ask a question of Alejandro and Roki then about the connection between new kinds of historical discovery, say about the pervasiveness of resistance in Angola, or about the complexity of slave property and the rights that enslaved people claimed. What kind of consequences might you envision from the robust and deeper history that you're in the process of writing? What could the consequences of that be for the political possibilities in the present and towards our broader understandings of slavery's legacies in the present?
Well, in the Angolan case, we don't find in Angola the issue of the memorialization of the slave trade. We find that in relation to Rainha Ginga, Queen Ginga. But my hope as a specialist was always that, like in Brazil, in Angola, we would have the intellectual production on Angola made by Angolans, which even 10 years removed from the Civil War, we can say that we're moving towards that direction. But we are not there yet. So I think to the extent that we can uncover and unearth information about how, against all odds, Angolans were able to exercise agency, shape their history, be at the center of their history, even in conditions such as the slave trade. I think that's important in terms of the memory, in terms of identity, in terms of how people appropriate the past. Now, I do think that we need Angolans doing that. And I hope to be able, perhaps in the future, to help people, train people, facilitate the training of scholars so Angolan-based people, or people who would come to the US, or people who would come to Brazil, and then they can go back, and with an Angolan sensitivity, which sometimes I feel that I lack, that they can write that history. Particularly when it comes to language, and which is critical here. Moving beyond this reliance on Portuguese written sources, and exploring oral histories, and combining these two types of sources. And in order to do that, as an outsider, as a foreigner, I feel like a person that comes from there could really do the job much better than any of us could do it.
I think it's a great question. It's the question that brings, in fact, all these things we're talking about together. My thoughts on this would be that the politics, the contemporary politics of slavery and the slave trade can never and should never be based on the obliteration of the agency and the initiative and the humanity of the slaves themselves. I mean, we should resist the temptation, however powerful, I think, of simply characterizing slaves as a thing, as an abstraction, in order to advance certain contemporary political agendas. The fact that enslaved people managed to do things like this, managed to bring cases to courts, managed to try to carve spaces within slavery, try to find ways to control portions of their time, their labor, speaks to their incredible resourcefulness, which doesn't diminish at all, of course, what slavery as a system was about, and that core concept of owning a person's life. I think our job is not to walk away from these complexities and from these nuances. It is actually to reconstruct and to understand these nuances and to place them in a larger picture of slavery. What we are doing, in a sense, and I see some overlap here, and that's not a coincidence, is that where the historiography currently is on this, is on the one hand, we are trying to write histories in which Africans and their actions and their ideas are taken much more seriously than ever before. They're a major part of the story, even something as foreign as slave law. One would not expect to find that there. I find it. And second, we are trying, as soon as you go down to the ground and you find real human beings, what you are going to find is things like this. People trying to desperately to find ways to carve out spaces for autonomy, trying to improve their lives of their children. One of the big legal debates about quartación is what happens with children who haven't been born yet. Many mothers will try to fix the price, the manumission price, at that point, because an unborn baby in the marketplace was very cheap, right? So if you could fix the price, the manumission price, at the market price of an unborn baby, you are basically guaranteeing the freedom of your child a few years later at a very, very low price. The response of the owners was, no way, we're not going to accept this. We will accept selling the unborn child outright right now. We'll take the whole price, but we will not take a portion. We will not just take an installment on that price because you are buying that. And in the meantime, since it was still an enslaved person, the owner had to support that child until she or he became free. So there you go, how enslaved people tried to work out the system, and Wesley got it right, worked out their freedom. These are people who are trying desperately to find ways. So I don't think we should walk away from that. We should not be shy about that. We should embrace those initiatives. We should study those initiatives. and still try to locate them in this general vision of slavery as a terrible system. I mean, these two things have to be compatible.
Also, neither do I believe we should walk away from the discussion about legacy, because the tremendous amount of work done by scholars on slave life, on slave labor, or on the labor of enslaved people, and on the life of enslaved people. But we are not seeing similar productivity in respect to studies on legacies, which in a sense is arguably very relevant today. In the case of this country, when we examine the movement in the historiography, we find that the explosion in slavery studies had to wait until the civil rights process had matured and brought results. It had matured, brought results, thousands of people killed in the struggle, issues go to the Congress, and in the aftermath of that came the explosion in the study of slave life and slave labor. Now, why is there a silence on the legacies aspect of it? Which is now the challenge today. How does this literature of life and labor translate into the literature on legacies? And what do we have to wait for? What kind of cataclysmic political event do we have to wait for before we throw ourselves into a major research agenda into legacies? Now, that, I believe, is the issue now. So where is the new resistance? Where is the new anti-slavery resistance? The new anti-slavery resistance is in the struggle to resist the state's interpretation of this history. And that is really the environment in which we are in. And that literature, that anti-slavery literature, is going to be in the future about this legacy, the control and the ownership of this legacy. And so it is not forthcoming as aggressively as it ought. I know, for example, of the work by Professor Shepard, and she will speak to that later today, a highly skilled and organized strategy to deal with legacy issues. But there isn't much of it taking place. In the slave routes, in the UNESCO Slave Routes Project, of which I'm a member, we have forged a project at the UN level to deal with the politics of resistance in terms of the legacy. But we are finding a certain kind of silence and to some extent a retreat of scholars. And what is particularly interesting is that some scholarship that speaks and research the kind of analysis that we've heard from Ferreira, sorry, I'm confused. Ferreira, which speaks of resistance in the Middle Passage in West Africa and so on. Those kinds of scholars are not now participating in the resistance over legacy. They are very productive in one area, very silent in another area. And we do know why, because the politics of legacy is very recriminatory and very hostile. And one can understand why scholars might not wish to engage in the politics and resistance of legacy, because they can cost you. So therein lies, in a sense, a moral divide in academia between the historicizing of life and labor and the retreat and silence on legacy. And that is where we're all confronted at the moment. What do we do? Where do we go? What do we say? And what are we waiting for in order to intellectualize legacy as an important frontier for research?
This is a profound challenge, and I thank you for bringing it so explicitly to the group, because all of us here in our scholarly work do face the confinements of our institutional lives, the expectations of our professional trajectories, the limitations of our disciplines, and yet matching that up with the political imperatives of the present, it's certainly not easy. And so, again, I thank you for bringing it out so explicitly. I recognize that there are numerous others who had hoped to bring comments to the floor at the end of this session. We are at the conclusion, and as Professor Bose mentioned, we need to be fairly strict about the time here. So before we do anything else, please join me in thanking our three panelists for their excellent